Hi, my name is Carl McConkey, and today we'll be looking at Biodiversity the Habitats Directive. The little basic presentation is going to take approximately 5 minutes. It may go slightly over to about 6. What we're going to look at, the Biodiversity the Habitats Directive. What is it? A little bit about it. Then we're going to look at a case study, the effects it's had in a place, and then draw any conclusions that we can from that. Essentially what we're looking at is, can a directive that's put up for a positive purpose have a negative impact on a place? As for references then, the Centre for Social and Economic Research on Global Environment, Research Centre of the UK Economic and Social Research Council, and Implementing EU Biodiversity Policy, a UK case study. So the Habitats Directive itself then, finalised in 1992, it's conservation of natural habitats, fauna and flora, and it's deemed as an essential object of general interest pursued by the European community as a whole. It works in conjunction with the Wild Bird Directives of 2009, which is again looking at protecting endangered birds, species and habitats. Obviously within the EU, many different areas, vast biodiversity, so it's particularly relevant. The Habitats Directive itself then, biodiversity conservation based on regulations and protected areas. It's often been criticised as being costly, insufficient, but it's actually one of the most commonly used precautionary measures for natural protection. So it's widely used without the EU, although it's not without its flaws like any policy. But we'll look a little bit of that later. It operates a no net loss policy, which essentially means that any area under the protection of the Habitats Directive cannot suffer any loss or degradation to the area, ecosystem, etc. So the case study then, Hickling. It's in the Norfolk and Suffolk Broads, and it's basically a huge area, which is a national park. However, not officially it is, but not in name. It's a complex wetland system consisting of low-lying rivers, shallow lakes, or broads, marshlands and fens. It's protected under the Habitat Directive, which is why we're looking at it. It's utilised by a range of different stakeholders. It's quite a dynamic area. So we've got recreation and amenity users, conservation interests, as well as local residents living and working within the area. The Broads Authority are under a statutory obligation then to preserve and enhance all aspects of the Broads for all interest groups. And obviously there can be some overlap, but also some conflict in the different interest groups and what they want the area for, which will become apparent. Norfolk Broads then, as we see southeast England, Norwich here on the very east coast, Great Yarmouth. This entire area is known as the Broads, we see here. Obviously a lot of parkland, and as I said, a lot of waterways, etc. We're looking at Hickling Broad just up here. Again, a large area. But take into account the waterways and rivers, because we'll look at those in a minute as well. So impacts then. Historically, the area has been used a lot for boating, and it's brought in a lot of tourism and a lot of money. The Broads Authority actually levy a charge for anybody using the waterways, and again, this brings in a lot of tourism specifically to use the waterways, and it generates money. The Broads Authority itself is actually not subject to the Stanford Principle like all other national parks in the UK, which basically give a sole focus point on nature conservation. So Hickling Broad then has a wide range of activities without one specific purpose. So obviously the authority then has to perform a pretty complex task of trying to sustainably manage the natural conservation, but also the needs of everybody else using it and the money generated and the revenue. So it's an area that is fairly in demand. During the summer months then, the aquatic weeds tend to grow a lot, and it infringes on the boating activities. So in the past, it's been an accepted management practice just to cut the weeds back. As of late then, nutrient loading has gone down, and the aquatic weed and other weeds on the banks have grown massively. which means that essentially it's blocking the boats to get through the waterways, which is, again, as I said, one of the main interest areas or interest activities of the area. So a large-scale cutting plan was put in place, but this was in conflict to some of the interest from the English Nature, a statutory natural conservation agency. They said it's damaging the ecosystem, and if anything damages the ecosystem, then obviously it's having a negative impact. And because of the Habitats Directive, no net loss policy, it has to step in. So it stepped in through the Broads Authority and said, you can't do this. So they stopped the cutting, which meant that it had a massive impact on the boating itself and other people using the area, or specifically the waterways. What's interesting is consideration of issues such as impacts on recreation and related socio-economic activities. And any visual impacts not thought to actually carry any legal weight under the Habitats Directive as it's been interpreted in the UK. And again, that's the interpretation of it. So any loss to the area has no legal ramifications the way it's been read. The initial cutting plan was to cover 130 hectares, so it was then reduced down to 14.8 hectares, which again, that's not great for the people using the boats. A lot of money is being lost and a lot of tourism is in decline in the area, so it's obviously very obvious to the Broads Authority that they need to cut this back. However, they're limited by this policy and the no net loss policy, which is just saying, look, you can't do this, you can't have any kind of negative impact on the biodiversity. So the management plan from the Broads Authority, because their hands were tied, was more or less a wait and see thing. And they simply said to quantify more precisely the socio-economic impacts of curtailed sailing activities in Hickling Broad. A very, very vague statement, which essentially boiled down to we can't really do anything, let's wait and see. However, they knew what the impacts were. So the conclusion then, a policy or a directive that was put in place for a very positive reason, to maintain biodiversity, to keep the area safe. It's all a very positive thing. But on a strategic level, it's not one size fits all. So because it covers the entire EU, if the plan or the policy is looked at very, very statically or rigidly, it simply doesn't fit because each area is different. So because Hickling Broad is such a dynamic and constantly changing ecosystem through the seasons, and with the wide interest groups, it really needs to be used more as a flexible framework rather than simply you cannot have any kind of adverse effect to the ecosystem. Because again, that depends on how it's interpreted as a negative impact. So what's a negative impact to the English Nature Agency could be very, very different to the say the boating people or the sailing community who see that maybe as a negative impact, although it may not be on the ecosystem of the plant or the aquatic weeds. It does have negative impacts in other ways. So to conclude then, it's a positive policy, however, it needs to be looked at with a flexible mind by the agencies under the Habitats Directive. And if that's done, then using common sense, you can apply the directive to different areas, using the overall directive as a framework, and then trusting the agencies to kind of do the right thing. And perhaps come up with a level that the no net loss policy is not one that can be used in every single area if it has many, many different user groups and stakeholders. Thanks very much.